Hey, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're jumping into your collection of sources on really one of the most influential figures in missionary history, Adoniram Judson. Our mission today is, well, it's to cut through the sheer volume of material, the articles, the research, your notes, and pull out the most important nuggets, the key knowledge and insight. We really want to help you get well-informed and quickly about his pretty extraordinary and, well, complex life.
And it is a huge amount of material you've got there. It covers, his entire journey, right from his earliest days, that kind of unexpected call to missions, through decades of incredibly intense work, significant suffering, deep into his personal life, those immense losses, and then ultimately his lasting impact. We're talking several continents, generations.
It's quite a journey we're about to take with you through this material. Following this skeptical, intellectually searching young man, all the way to becoming this global missionary figure. A life marked by, well, profound dedication and just immense personal tragedy. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning. What do your sources tell us about young Adoniram? I'm seeing things like a cute boy and his father really expecting him to be a great man.
Yeah, that early expectation, it's striking, isn't it? It suggests a certain path was kind of assumed for him. But what's equally fascinating in the material is how his intellectual journey went away from that expected religious background, at least initially. The sources really highlight his college years and the influence of what they term French infidelity, leading him towards skeptical views. He even became, for a while, a professed unbeliever alongside a friend.
Right, so not exactly the path his father might have hoped for at first. The turning point then seems pretty dramatic.
Oh, absolutely. The material emphasizes his conversion experience wasn't just a, simple change of heart. It was radical, a conscious choice. It involved a solemn dedication of himself to God, and crucially, a consecration to the Christian ministry. And this call wasn't just general. The sources point out it was specifically toward foreign missions, evangelizing the heathen, as they put it.
And this feeling, it wasn't just him, was it? There's this sense from the sources that this idea was suddenly like in the atmosphere among young men.
Exactly. The sources describe it springing up almost simultaneously in different people, different places, not top down, more like a grassroots stirring.
Which brings us to that famous moment, the haystack meeting.
Yes, definitely a pivotal event. That prayer meeting, Williams College, during a storm with Samuel Mills and others, it really solidified their decision, their resolve to send the gospel to Asia. They formed the Brethren, this group dedicated to that specific purpose.
And that dedication had a direct kind of organizational outcome, didn't it?
It did. That meeting, their appeals, it led straight to forming the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in 1810. Judson and several associates became their very first missionaries. And it wasn't tentative. His early letters show this complete commitment, almost like a sense of destiny.
So they set sail, full of purpose, under the American board. But the journey itself, well, it held an unexpected twist, according to your sources. Tell me about that.
This is where the story takes a really interesting turn. While he was translating the New Testament on that long sea voyage from America, Judson started wrestling deeply with baptism, the meaning, the mode. The material says he came to the conclusion that, quote, the Baptists were right.
Wow, that takes some serious intellectual honesty, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you're already committed elsewhere, heading out on their mission.
It absolutely does. They weren't planning this. They weren't setting out to become Baptists. They knew they'd meet Baptists in Serampore, India, and felt they had to examine it closely. But initially, the sources say it was to defend their existing views.
But actually, reading books on both sides led them somewhere totally different. And his wife, Anne, she was initially resistant.
Yes, the sources said Anne was definitely against it at first, reportedly said she wouldn't become a Baptist even if he did.
This really highlights the personal cost of conviction, doesn't it? They knew this decision would, quote, wound and grieve friends back home, the very people who supported them. It would almost certainly cost them their funding from the board and mean being separated from our missionary associates, basically going it alone.
Precisely. Yet they chose to embrace what they saw as the truth. The sources note, however mortifying, however great the sacrifice. That commitment, conviction over comfort or security, it's just central to their story.
And this incredibly tough personal decision, the separation from the board, which Judson apparently felt was one of the most distressing events of his life.
Yeah.
It had this unexpected massive impact back in America.
That's one of the great ironies the sources bring out, yeah. His willingness to be their missionary, the Baptists, even without a society backing him at that moment, it acted as the crystallizing touch for the scattered American Baptists. His conviction, it kind of jarred and shaken them into forming a solid and enduring form, essentially creating the American Baptist Missionary Society because he needed sending.
What a turn of events. So after all that internal struggle and external uncertainty, they finally reached Burma. But arrival wasn't exactly smooth sailing either.
No, not at all. The sources paint a picture of immediate hardship in Rangoon. There was illness right away. Mrs. Judson's servant died suddenly. Anne herself got gravely ill near the Andaman Islands, so weak she had to be carried ashore in an armchair by natives, which certainly caused a stir.
A dramatic entrance indeed. What was the environment like there, beyond those immediate personal crises?
Well, the sources describe Burma as beautiful, but marked by intense oppression. The local people had, quote, no inducement to labor because rulers would just take anything they gained. And foreign missionaries, bringing new ideas. They were immediately viewed with suspicion, potential danger by the government.
So tackling the language in that kind of climate must have been incredibly tough. How did they even start?
Interestingly, the sources mention Anne Judson took on managing the household. And this practical necessity, dealing with locals daily, actually became her primary way of learning Burmese. She was speaking it all day. The sources say she initially became more fluent in conversation than Mr. Judson.
Ah, that's a neat detail. What were their first tools then for actual ministry in this new, difficult place?
They started small but strategically. The sources mention the first ever printed statement of Christian truth for Burmans, a tract, and they got a vital gift, a press and types from the Brethren back in Serampore. Though money for paper and supplies was still a huge issue.
So ministry began, but it wasn't just a straight path forward. There were setbacks early on, like Judson's trip to Chittagong.
Yes, that trip was a major frustration. He went trying to gather some native helpers, Christian assistants, but his plan just got completely derailed by, well, a series of events, contrary winds, having to change ships, ending up detained in Madras for a long time, unexpectedly.
And this unplanned absence had knock-on effects back in Rangoon.
It did. He was gone much longer than anyone expected. And when he finally got back, he heard the mission had basically broken up. The situation was just too dangerous. His wife, Anne, had actually booked passage to leave for Bengal. But, remarkably, she turned back alone right before the ship left. The sources say it showed a real reluctance to leave the place, despite the clear danger.
Wow. So he returns to this really difficult situation. But he did eventually start public ministry.
He did, yes. The sources note he began public worship, regular preaching in Burmese, but only after he felt he had a pretty good grasp of the language. Which seems wise, right? To avoid causing trouble with the government too soon.
And this period was also marked by political uncertainty. Lots of instability.
Constantly, yeah. Worries about the local viceroy, rumors flying about rebellion, the king being sick, maybe dead. This whole climate just made the viceroy view any new religion with an unfavorable eye. Very suspicious.
But amidst all these challenges, these delays, came the first real breakthrough. The first convert.
A huge moment, a moment of immense joy after years of really difficult labor. The sources describe the baptism of Mung Nao in a pond near a huge statue of Gautama Buddha. He was the first Burman convert.
A hopeful sign. But that hope was quickly challenged, wasn't it?
Almost immediately, yes. The viceroy heard that a prominent teacher might convert. His reaction was ominous, just 2 words. Inquire further. That brief sentence, the sources note, it just scattered the group of inquirers as quickly as the lifted hand disperses a school of fish. People were terrified.
The converts themselves, though, they stood firm, which is amazing given the risks. But the work stalled because people were just too scared to even visit the mission. So what did Judson do? This seems like a dead end.
Facing that standstill, he made a decision the sources call the wisest. But it was incredibly bold. He decided to go directly to Ava, the capital city. Bypass the local guys, go straight to the top. Seek permission from the emperor himself. The sources use that great phrase, he chose to beard the lion in his lair.
That sounds incredibly risky. A high-stakes gamble? What happened when they actually got there?
It was a tough journey. They arrived carrying gifts, hoping for a good reception. They met officials, went through the proper channels, but ultimately, the sources say, they got a decided repulse. They were basically hurried away without much ceremony, just exhausted from the effort.
They didn't give up right away, though. Try it again.
No, they still cherished some hope, tried for another meeting, but the result was the same. No access, no approval. They returned to their boat, according to the sources, completely exhausted in body and mind. That direct appeal had failed.
And then the situation got much, much worse, didn't it? The war with the British escalated.
Yes, exactly. The British Army advanced, and suddenly any foreigners, especially English or Americans like Judson and Dr. Price, were viewed with intense suspicion. Spies, basically. This led directly to their horrific captivity and sufferings at Ava, a period described in agonizing detail in your sources, mostly through Ann Judson's letters.
It's incredibly hard to read about. The immediate confiscation of all their belongings and desperately trying to get help, and that chilling reply from the Queen.
The teachers will not die, let them remain as they are, seems harmless, but it condemned them to brutal imprisonment. Ann's account reveals the harsh reality. For 10 days, she couldn't even get inside the prison, tried writing notes until she was caught. That cost her money, and she wrote 2 or 3 days of agony, fearing the punishment. For almost a year and a half, she said she was so consumed by the present scenes and sufferings, she seldom reflected on a single occurrence of my former life. Just survival mode.
We hear about the conditions, the infamous death prison at Ung Pen La, the awful heat, the chains galling their limbs.
The sources paint a truly grim picture, and Anne's actions during this time, they're just extraordinary. Visiting daily, bribing keepers for tiny mercies, bringing food, constantly pleading for her husband's release. She even managed, the sources say, to make the old prison governor cry with her appeals. Just relentless effort.
And it was during this nightmare that she gave birth.
Yes, to their daughter, Maria, and in one of the most poignant moments described, just 20 days after giving birth, she carried the baby, this little blue-eyed blossom, to the prison doorway. So Adoniram, still in chains, could crawl forward to see his wife and his newborn child for the first time.
That image. And the poem he wrote about Maria from prison, Where Fettered Felons Lie. It's just incredibly powerful and heartbreaking.
It really captures the depth of the suffering, and the sources, they don't sanitize the brutality they were surrounded by. There's that disturbing description from the death prison mentioning the tiger executioner, the cords used for torture, the fearful cries, the shrieks, the low, sad moans of victims. It underlines the constant real threat they lived under.
The end of the war finally brought their release, but it wasn't straightforward. It was tied directly to the changing political needs.
Absolutely. Kind of ironic, really. The Burmese government, suddenly desperate about the English advance on the capital, suddenly saw Judson and Dr. Price not as enemy spies, but as valuable assets. They needed them as translators and consultants for negotiating with the British general, Sir Archibald Campbell.
So they were released from that death prison, only to be immediately put to work.
Pretty much. Released, though briefly confined again, then sent straight to Maloon. There, Judson, still really sick with fever, was forced to translate. He reportedly suffered as much as he had at any time in prison, excepting he was not in irons. He even tried to avoid going to the English camp himself, got Dr. Price appointed as the main negotiator, but had to stand security for Price's return.
This period also shows just how volatile and brutal the regime was, even as it was collapsing.
Definitely. The sources mention the swift, brutal execution of a Burmese general who failed against the English. Beaten and killed before even reaching the execution spot. It shows the arbitrary power, the danger, right up to the very end.
And tragically, the suffering didn't end with their freedom from prison.
No. The personal cost was just devastating. Ann Judson, whose incredible efforts during the imprisonment had completely broken her health. She succumbed to illness shortly after they were released and settled in Amherst. She died there. The sources include a heartbreaking letter describing her final days, her burial under the hopia tree, near where she first landed in Burma years before.
And the loss didn't stop there. Their little daughter, Maria.
Their daughter, Maria, who others had cared for while Anne was recovering, she died just 6 months later, buried next to her mother. Judson wrote about being left alone in the wide world, having buried, quote, 1 in Rangoon and 2 in Amherst. Just unthinkable loss.
This level of personal tragedy is almost unimaginable. The sources also mention other losses within the missionary community.
Yes, they do provide that context. They mention the earlier death of Sarah Boardman's daughter, little Sarah, from apoplexy. And Sarah Boardman Judson's own death later is described, focusing on her faith, her patience, and suffering. The sources also highlight how painful it was for families like the Comstocks to leave their children behind in America to return to the field, calling it the keenest suffering. It helps you understand the scope of sacrifice.
Despite these absolutely crushing blows, Judson kept going. Your sources describe a period after all this suffering where he seemed drawn towards asceticism.
Yes, they mention a tendency towards what's called Gionism, or engaging in forms of self-mortification. This included things like giving away his personal property to the mission board, destroying his personal correspondence, letters, and deliberately withdrawing from social life, even though the sources indicate he was naturally very sociable.
It sounds like a really profound reaction to the trauma and loss he'd experienced.
It seems like it. A period of deep internal wrestling, maybe trying to process it all before eventually finding what the sources call an equilibrium. The material then describes the mission house in Maulmain, built on land given by Sir Archibald Campbell, strategically located for contact with local people, but also, the sources point out, exposed to dangers. Tigers, robbers from across the river. It wasn't exactly safe.
And there was a specific incident there, a robbery you mentioned.
Yes, a bold robbery. 20 or 30 armed men cut open the house at night. The really extraordinary detail is that the family apparently slept right through it. They attributed their safety to a protecting wing, a soft, invisible hand. It just highlights the constant peril they lived with.
Amidst all of this, the core work, the translation, continued. That seems to be the constant thread.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize that finishing the Burman Bible translation was the steady undercurrent through everything, all the toil, suffering, loss. He actually finished the first draft around the time he married Sarah Boardman.
It's mentioned, though, that translation wasn't necessarily his favorite thing to do.
No, apparently not. The sources say he had little relish for it. He much preferred preaching, viva voce, face-to-face, but he clearly understood its fundamental long-term importance for establishing Christianity in Burma. The sources describe how difficult the language was, its unique structure, the lack of words for key Christian concepts. His process was painstaking. Constant reading, working with assistants, meticulous review of corrections.
And beyond the Bible itself, he also put a lot of focus on distributing other printed materials, like tracts.
Oh, absolutely. He saw the huge strategic value in that. He couldn't travel and preach everywhere, but in a place like Rangoon, he could freely give out materials. He saw it as the key of the country, tracts going everywhere from there. He observed a flood tide of eager curiosity among the people and really believed the printed page could be a mighty engine for reaching them.
He even made desperate appeals back home for more tracts, right? Specifying titles he needed, getting frustrated by printing delays.
It shows his strategic mind, yeah, and his eagerness to seize that moment of curiosity. His views on missionary strategy also come through in the sources. He suggested missionaries were actually more effective when dispersed in different stations, rather than being cooped up together. He even noted that being alone in a station with her husband could make a missionary wife a new creature, highlighting the power of focused, dedicated effort in one place.
He also continued touring when he could, beyond the main mission stations.
Yes, he visited places like Prome, labored there for months, hoped the big local idol, Shui Landau, would eventually be torn down. He saw thousands hear the gospel. Some converted, many others were enlightened, but too afraid to commit openly. He also toured Karen villages, finding different responses. In one case, an assistant was beaten by a local priest, Judson's response, praying for forgiveness for the persecutors.
And the Karens, they seem to have had a particularly strong interest.
Very much so. The sources describe them as literally crying out aloud for a written language so they could read the scriptures themselves. There were even messages coming from a Karen prophet seeking instruction. The material also mentions other areas like Arakan, Kaikfiu, all needing missionaries, just showing the vastness of the work still ahead.
The sources also cover his later marriages, after Anne's death. First to Sarah Boardman.
Yes, Sarah Boardman, herself a missionary widow already working in Burma, a partner in the work.
And after Sarah died, he married Emily Chubbuck.
Right. Significantly younger, an American journalist and writer he met during his only furlough back to the States. The sources do note this latter marriage caused some controversy, maybe due to the age difference or her background. They describe Emily as a writer known for her spirit, her vivacity, and extraordinary dramatic power in her literary sketches. His later family life, even after the horrors in Ava, continued this pattern of, well, joy mixed with real sorrow. The sources list the children born with Sarah in Maulmain: Abby Ann, Adoniram Brown, Elnathan, Henry Luther, who was stillborn, and Henry Hall. There's a touching letter included from Judson to his daughter Abby Ann, mentioning her brothers, showing his deep affection for them.
And the pain of loss struck again, even in these later years.
Tragically, yes. Little Henry died at Serampore. The family was on a voyage for health reasons. He was just over a year old. The sources include Judson's poignant letter describing the boy's last moments, calling out Nani, which Judson explained was his sort of imperfect word for naughty when he felt uncomfortable or unwell. Just heartbreaking.
Despite these ongoing personal heartbreaks, his dedication to the core work, like the dictionary, remained incredibly intense.
It really did. The sources mention him resuming work on that massive dictionary project. He even turned down an invitation to revisit America for his health because he felt he had to prioritize the dictionary. The manuscripts were in such a state, apparently, that only he could finish it. He also wrote very powerfully to his sons who were studying back in America, urging them towards conversion, towards baptism, emphasizing the ultimate importance, saying, "Oh, heaven is all, life, life, eternal life." Just intense focus.
But his own health did eventually fail seriously.
Yes, inevitably. The sources describe his final illness, the decision that a long sea voyage was the only hope for recovery. Even the departure was difficult. He had to be carried on board the ship. And then the voyage itself was frustratingly delayed right at the start because of some military red tape.
And his death finally came at sea.
Yes. It's described with a kind of quiet dignity in the sources. Despite intense pain just before, in his final hour, he was apparently calm, peaceful, holding a friend's hand. His breath just gradually faded until he was gone. The sources simply state, the agony of death was past.
The losses surrounding him continued even after his death, didn't they?
They did. His son with Emily, who they called Angel Charlie, was born after his father's death and died shortly after. And Emily herself faced declining health, writing movingly about Sweet Mother, reflecting on her grief and her own mortality.
So we followed this incredible, often brutal life story. Looking back, what do the sources say about his lasting impact, his legacy?
Oh, the sources are very clear on his monumental legacy. That personal decision about baptism, born out of his own study and conviction, it directly spurred the formation of the American Baptist Missionary Union, a major, major force in missions. And remember, his initial work was under the American Board. The sources note that by 1880, both organizations had seen huge growth, operating missions worldwide. So he was part of, and really a catalyst for, this much broader movement.
He was welcomed back as a hero on that one return trip to the U.S. years into his mission work.
Absolutely revered. But it's interesting, the sources note his own feeling during that furlough. He described himself like a steersman in a storm, feeling disoriented, almost doubting his own identity amidst conflicting memories, looking for friends from decades before who just weren't there anymore. It shows how profoundly those years had changed him.
The sources really emphasize the suffering, having the distinction of suffering for Christ, limbs galled by fetters, walking on burning sands with bleeding feet. He was deeply cherished in America.
Yes, they include powerful accounts, like Dr. Jeter's welcome address in Virginia, expressing how people had followed his journey from afar, how they'd sympathized with his suffering, shed tears thinking about Anne buried under the hopia tree, and rejoiced in his successes. He became this powerful symbol of missionary commitment and endurance through suffering.
We've certainly taken a deep dive into the sources you provided. We've traced Adoniram Judson's path from that ambitious, kind of skeptical youth wrestling with big ideas, to his profound conversion, his incredibly challenging life as a missionary, the deep, just relentless personal suffering he endured, his painstaking and vital work of translation and evangelism, and finally his immense and complex legacy.
It's a story defined by, well, intense conviction, isn't it? Conviction that drove him through unimaginable hardship, strategic thinking in the face of brutal difficulty, and just heartbreaking personal loss that seemed to shadow his whole life. Your sources reveal a man who really grappled with profound ideas and faced brutal realities, all driven by the singular purpose, bringing the gospel to Burma.
We heard about his early skepticism, that intellectual pride, how his personal crisis over baptism became a crystallizing touch for a whole new mission movement. The constant dangers he faced from a hostile government, a dangerous environment, even armed robbers. We saw the incredible heroism and suffering of Ann Judson during that horrific imprisonment in Ava. We heard about the devastating series of deaths, his wives, his children. We learned about his relentless focus on the slow, hard work of translation, distributing tracts, even when he personally preferred preaching face-to-face. And we saw that unwavering, intense piety that drove him, sometimes, perhaps, even to extremes of self-denial.
And the sources also offer these important glimpses into the lives of the early converts, right? The immense challenges they faced, even children being persecuted for their new faith. It highlights the incredibly high stakes for everyone involved.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, thinking about the man himself. Your sources present what seems like a fascinating tension in his character. On the one hand, you have a quote from a friend calling his the life of what the English would call a good fellow, elevated and purified and beautified by religion. This friend describes him as brilliant, genial, considerate, someone who planned pleasant surprises, sent affectionate notes. Sounds like a great guy.
Right. But then, as we discussed, elsewhere, the sources detail his deliberate pursuit of forms of self-mortification, especially after the intense suffering. Destroying his personal papers, his letters, correspondence we'd love to have now, purposefully withdrawing from society into solitude.
So it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Hmm?
How do we reconcile that picture? The sociable, kind, brilliant, good fellow, with the man who seemed at times to actively seek out hardship, destroy historical records of his own life, and pull back from the very society he was apparently so skilled at navigating.
It really raises an important question, I think, about the complex interplay between, someone's innate personality, the profound shaping power of deep conviction, and the transformative and maybe sometimes contradictory effects that immense suffering and loss can have on a person's life, their character, how they present themselves to the world.
Definitely something for you to mull over as you process everything we've unpacked today from
Yeah.
those sources.